A pleasure, a special pleasure to introduce my daughter, Atara Kelman, who is Rabbi Joseph spoke. He's from Montreal. Atara is the official Yoetzet Halacha of the Bailey Shul, the Tiferet Bet Shevet Jerusalem in Montreal. She spends more of her time teaching at Ramaz, and I guess maybe much of her time raising her two little daughters. And it's a pleasure to welcome her back after a too long hiatus to Torah in Motion. Atara, we're looking forward to your shir. Vakasha.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Kelman, for the invitation.
Oh my
And thank you to
gosh.
all of you for being here this morning and learning together with us. In a minute, I will share my screen. So everyone has the sources. The link is also in the chat. I don't promise that I'll see the chat while I'm speaking, but hopefully at the end, I'll have time to look through it. So there's a lot of metaphors throughout Jewish literature for sin, for chata'im, and for tshuva, and for righteousness. There's many in Tanakh have to do with cleanliness and dirty, or broken and whole, or there are colors associated with sin. We see it in Chazal, we see it in the Sidur, but what's less common is physical objects that are associated with sin or that are associated with tshuva. Probably the most famous example of a physical object associated with this process is the Sir Hamishtalayach, the scapegoat that I think is its own shir during the Yom Iyun today. But what I want to argue in the time that we have together is that there's a different object. And those are the Luchot, specifically the first tablets that God gave Moshe at Har Sinai, that can serve as a model for the tshuva process and for the process of sin and repentance. And so what our goal through our time together is going to be is the first thing we're going to do is I'm gonna try to prove the connection between the Luchot and Yom Kippur and argue that the Luchot and Yom Kippur are actually tied very closely together. After we do that, we're gonna look at three different sources that learn something from the broken Luchot. They are not all explicitly talking about tshuva, and they're not all explicitly talking about sin, but I think that we can learn from each of those sources something that's relevant to this time period. Now, obviously, the Luchot themselves are not something that represent sin. The Luchot were God's greatest gift to mankind at Har Sinai, but what we're specifically interested is the broken Luchot, and the Luchot that were broken when Moshe descends from Har Sinai. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to look at the first source. Here we go. Okay. Great. Broken and whole. Luchot is a paradigm for tshuva. Here we go. Okay, so Rashi is one of the sources that explicitly links, and he's not the first source, but it's a good summary here, the process of the broken Luchot and the new Luchot with Yom Kippur. So if we look at Rashi's comment here from Shmot Lamed Aleph, Rashi says as follows, Ein mukdamu muchar b'Torah. So this is actually one of the probably top 10 debates in Parshanu in commentary on the Torah. Rashi claims that the Torah is not written in chronological order. And the reason why Rashi is talking about this now is Rashi has to deal with this tension at the end of Sefer Shmot, where we go through the whole story of the Exodus. We go through the story of Har Sinai, and then the narrative switches to the laws of building the Mishkan, only to then be interrupted by Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, and then returns back to the laws of the Mishkan, of building the tabernacle. And all the commentaries have to figure out, well, what was the actual chronological sequence, because the narrative is a little bit interrupted. So Rashi claims it's not necessarily in the sequence that it's presented, and really Ma'aseh ha'egel kodem letzivoy melachat hamishkan yamim rabim haya. Rashi claims even though the sin of the golden calf is recorded after the instruction to build the tabernacle, it actually preceded it historically. And Rashi now tries to align all the dates with the events that happened. So Rashi argues, Sharei b'yodzayim b'tamuz nishtabru haluchot. So Moshe goes up and gets the Torah on Shavuot. Then on the 17th of Tammuz, he comes down, he sees the golden calf. Moshe, of his own initiative, smashes the Luchot. He goes back up to Har Sinai and prays to God. Ubeyom HaKippurim nitratzeh Kadosh Baruch Hu liYisrael ulamacharat hichil b'nidvat hamishkan v'ukam b'echad b'Nisan. On Yom Kippur, God forgives the Jewish people, And the next day, they start donating the contributions to the Mishkan, which is then dedicated on the 1st of Nisan. But what Rashi points out to us, which is, seems clear from a careful reading of Tanakh, is that Yom Kippur is actually the day of Matan Torah for the Luchot that were not broken. And so Yom Kippur, all of a sudden, it gives a lot of context for why Yom Kippur is on the date that it is, which is that's the date that God really forgave the Jewish people for the first national sin, the sin of the golden calf. That's the date that God gave us the second Luchot and repaired that relationship that are represented by the first Luchot. Now, the question then becomes, well, what did they do with that first set of Luchot, right? Moshe comes down the mountain, he sees the Jewish people dancing and celebrating around a golden calf, and he's appalled, and it seems he's angry, and it almost sounds like he's acting impulsively. It says he sent it, he like threw it. It doesn't sound like it was premeditated. God had already told him the Jewish people had sinned, and yet he throws them on the ground and smashes them. And the question is, what did they do with those broken pieces? So you could have imagined all sorts of approaches to answering that question. You could have imagined they would never have wanted to see them again. Maybe they would have put them in geniza, buried them. On the flip side, we have to remember that these luchot, the first tablets, were written by God. So in a certain sense, maybe we do want to preserve them. And what the Talmud ultimately teaches us is that those broken pieces from the luchot, from the first luchot, were preserved. And in the Gemara in Baba Bakr that I brought here, it's like a little bit of a collage of the Gemara. I apologize. I took the lines that are most relevant. The rabbis are trying to figure out, how do we know that both sets of luchot were preserved and both sets of the luchot were placed in the aron in the Mishkan? So the first attempt brought is based on a pasuk from Melachim, Ein ba'aron rak shnei luchot havanim asher hiniach sham Moshe, which says that in the aron there is only the two luchot that Moshe placed. And the Talmud uses a hermeneutical rule that says when there are two qualifications, one after another, it must be coming actually to include something else. Umani mekayim ein ba'aron rak lerabot shivrei luchot shemunachim ba'aron. So they say, oh, maybe this tells us that the broken tablets were also placed in the aron. And then the Gemara follows a very typical formula where it has all sorts of problems from learning it from this verse, because the verse might be needed for other things, or a different rabbi who has a different thing learned from this verse needs to learn it from somewhere else. Ultimately, they bring two other suggestions. So we'll just skip to those. One is from Shmuel Be, Asher Nikra Shem Hashem Tzvakot Yoshev Kruvim Alav, that the name of God that sits on the kruvim was on. So that that teaches us that the luchot and the shivrei luchot and the broken luchot were resting in the aron. This is also a problematic teaching because of what we need this pasuk for. So ultimately, the Gemara seems to settle on this third option that we'll read at the bottom, Midatani Rav Yosef. What Rav Yosef teaches, the Tani Rav Yosef, Asher Shibarta v'samtem, Melamed shaluchot v'shivrei luchot munachim ba'aron. So we'll look at this verse a little bit closer, but Rav Yosef looks at the verse from Dvarim that says Asher Shibarta, that it's describing what had happened at Har Sinai. It says Moshe broke the luchot, and then it says put them in the aron. And from the smichut, from the fact that those two phrases are adjacent to each other, Rav Yosef learns that both the broken ones and the second set and the intact ones were placed together in the aron. And this drasha seems to be the most accepted drasha for this idea that the first luchot, the ones that were broken, were also preserved and were also kept in the aron together with the second set. And if we want to look at that pasuk more closely, we can look here in Dvarim, which is again Moshe reminiscing and telling the Jewish people what had happened 40 years earlier. And he recalls, Ba'et hahi, at that time, Amar Hashem Eli, God said to me, Psol lecha shnei luchot avanim karishonim, make for yourself 2 luchot like the first ones. And again, there's almost this tension here because on the one hand, they're supposed to be like the first ones. At the same time, God is telling Moshe he should make them, were the first that God had made himself. Va'ala elai hahara va'asita lecha aron 8. Come up to me to the mountain and make a ark of wood where you'll be able to keep them. V'achtov al haluchot et hadvarim asher hayu al haluchot harishonim. I wrote on these tablets what had been written on the first tablets. Sorry, I will write on them asher shibarta v'samtem ba'aron, that you had broke and put them in the aron. And then the rest just recalls how Moshe did it. So again, because these two phrases appear next to each other, where there's a mention of the broken luchot together with the building and the placing of the new luchot, the Gemara learns that the first set of luchot were kept. Not only were they weren't kept by themselves, they were kept actually in the aron together with the new luchot. Apparently, though, this was not universally accepted. And there's an opinion, I'll bring it from the Yerushalmi, that suggests that it's true that the first luchot, the broken luchot, were preserved, but they weren't kept in the aron with the other luchot. They were kept in a separate ark. And the Yerushalmi records a debate on this question. So Tane Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish Omer, it quotes the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish, who says, Shnei arono hayu mehalchim im Yisrael bamidbar. There were 2 arks that actually traveled with the Jewish people throughout their time in the Midbar. Echad shehayta haTorah netuna betocho, ve'echad shehayu shivrei halucho netunim betocho. So there was one that had the Torah, which I assume is a reference to the second luchot, living in it, resting in it. And the other one had the broken pieces of the luchot placed into it. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish agrees that the first luchot, were kept. He just thinks they were kept in a separate ark. And then this helps explain some complications about which Aron traveled. There's all sorts of verses, both in Chumash and later in Navi, about the ark going out, and it's unclear if there was only one ark or 2. So for Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish, it's easier to explain there were 2 separate arks. The one that had the second tablets, Hayamunach be'ohel moed, that stayed permanently in the Ohel Moed, and that explains the pasuk that says Lo mashu mekerev hamachaneh, that the aron never left the camp. V'zeh shehayu shivrei haluchot betocho haya nichnas v'yotzei imahem upa'amim haya matra imahem. Sorry, I think someone is coloring by mistake. If they could erase that, that would be great. I don't know if everyone else sees that. Okay. And then, I don't know if I could, okay. And then
what you can do is you can stop the share and share again. There may be another way,
right.
but that's the only way I know of. Yeah, sorry. And please
No
be
problem.
careful. All the scribblers, the doodlers.
Okay. All right, we are back. So because the verse says that the Aron stayed in the camp, but we also know that an Aron traveled with the Jewish people to war, Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish's suggestion to solving that tension is there were 2 separate arks. One had the broken luchot, one had the intact luchot. But V'Rabbanan Amrei, the rabbis, it seemed like the majority opinion said Aron Echad Haya. There was only one ark. Upam Achat Yatza Bimei Eli V'Nishba. It only left once. That was in the times of Eli HaKohen, and it was actually taken captive by the Plishtim at that time. So really, there is a machlokat about whether they were kept in the same aron with the second luchot. But what we do see is there's a consensus that tells us that both the luchot and the broken luchot were preserved. And that's really the end of the first section of this year, where we've established 2 points. The first point that we've established is that the date of Yom Kippur is tied very closely to the luchot, because that is when the second luchot were given. The second luchot were a tikkun, were a fix for the first broken luchot. And the other main point that we've seen so far is that both sets of luchot were kept. The broken luchot were preserved as well, either in the same ark as the the second set or in their own separate arc. Okay. What we're going to do now is transition to the second part where we're going to look at three different sources that learn something about the Shivrei Luchot, and we're going to try to apply those to the idea of tshuva. So the first lesson that is taught from the idea of the broken Luchot is taught in two different versions in the Talmud. We'll read both of them. We'll see there's a little bit of a difference in the nuances between them, but the main point I think is similar. So this passage from Brachot, Rav Yeshua is giving a series of pieces of advice to his sons. So he says you should do Shnayim Mikra ve'echad Targum, you should do the Parsha every week, and he gives them advice on how to do Shchita. And then he gives a third piece of advice, and this is the one that's important to us. He says, V'hiz haru bizaken sheshachach talmudo machmat onso. Be careful with an elder who has forgotten what he has learned because of things outside of his control. De amrinan, as we say, luchot v'shivrei luchot munachot ba'aron. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi takes this teaching. He is following the consensus view that both sets of the tablets, the broken ones and the whole ones, were kept in the same ark. And he says the Luchot and the Shivrei Luchot, the whole tablets and the broken tablets, were kept in the ark together. What can we learn from that? We can learn from that we have to be respectful of elders who were very knowledgeable and now, because of circumstances beyond their control, have not have forgotten some of it. They still are deserving of respect. Don't disrespect them just because they've forgotten what they once knew. There's a slightly different version of this similar teaching in Menachot, Asher Shibarta v'samtem ba'aron. So it quotes that same pasuk that seems to be the key source for this idea. Tane Rav Yosef melamed shaluchot v'shivrei luchot munachim ba'aron. So he says we learn from this that both sets of the tablets were put in the aron. What does this teach us? Mikan letalmid chacham sheshachach talmudo machmat onso she'eino hagim bo minhag bizayon. From here we learn that a Torah scholar who has forgotten what he's learned, again, machmat onso, due to circumstances beyond his control, we do not treat that person with bizayon in a degrading way. So there's a few differences in these two texts. I think the two main differences are who we're talking about, right? In the first one we're talking about is zakein, an elder. In the second case, we're talking about a talmid chacham, someone who's learned but might not necessarily be older. The other difference in the formulation is I think this is more almost asserted in the positive, right? Like be careful to the zakein, whereas the one in Menachos is just saying don't treat them in a degrading manner, but is less of a, maybe it's a little bit of a lower bar. Now, what both of these ideas are doing, I think, and why they're linking them specifically to the Luchot is because they're both recognizing fragility. And they're saying that even if something changes or if something breaks, and here they're not talking about someone doing something wrong, they're talking about someone losing knowledge because of circumstances beyond their control, it is still important to preserve the dignity of those objects in the case of the Luchot, or of those people in the case of the Zakin, or in the case of the Talmid Chacham. And what I think this does especially is it highlights and links between the Luchot and the idea of mortality, which is, again, that same idea of fragility, which is something that's echoed over and over and over again in the season of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, especially in the Ashkenazi practice where we say Unatanik Tokef, but it also echoes these ideas, Al Tashlichenu le'et zikna, that we say in Slichot, don't throw us away when we become old. And I think part of the reason why we keep referencing mortality in the Sidur for both throughout the season of Rosh Hashanah and Slichot and Yom Kippur is because throughout Chazal, we see an assumption almost that thinking about mortality serves as an impetus to do the right thing and to do tshuva. And we see that in Pirkei Avot, when Akavia ben Mahalalel says, if you want to avoid sin, one of the things you should remember is where you're coming from, where you're going, and who you're going to need to stand before. There's another Gemara in the beginning of Brachot that says if someone thinks they're going to sin and learning isn't helping them and they can't do anything to help them, they should think about the day that they're going to die. And there's an assumption that if you think about your own mortality, that will encourage tshuva. And so what these first set of sources do for us is they link between the broken Luchot and getting old and forgetting things that you once knew. And they say both of those things, the Luchot and the person who is not as capable as they once were, are still deserving of kavod. And by doing that, they remind us of the fragility of our knowledge, the fragility of our life, the fragility of anything that is physical and material. And that, I think, can serve as an impetus for tshuva. So that's the first set of sources that I want to do. Now we're going to go to a second source from Rabbi Soloveitchik that's based on this Gemara, but he's going to add an explanation that I think can be meaningful for us now. Now, again, he's not explicitly talking about tshuva. He's not explicitly talking about the process of repentance, but I do think it can still be relevant to now. So he's trying to figure out, why did they keep the first set of broken Luchot in the Aron together with the first set? So he says, Nira lefarish, we can explain, Dimasha shivrei Luchot munacho ba'aron, the fact that the broken Luchot were placed in the Aron, hu mishum dechalin beluchot shnei dine kedusha. So this is a classic Brisker move. He says the reason why they were kept in the Luchot is because there's two aspects of the Luchot, and one of the aspects of the Luchot is sufficient to make it worthy of being kept in the Aron. So he says, what are the two aspects that exist in these physical objects of the Luchot? Aleph, the first one is Kedushat Haguf. There is sanctity to the body of the object, Mishum Dehave Miklei Mikdash Kamo Kli Shari, just like there is to any other object used in the Mishkan service. And then he says there's a second Kedusha, which is Kedushat Sefer Torah, the holiness, the sanctity that is afforded to a Sefer Torah. And he argues as follows. Venira Lomar, the Nishtabru Halucho, when the Luchot were broken, Pak'a mihem chalok Kedushat Sefer Torah. They lost that second Kedusha. They lost the sanctity of a Sefer Torah because they're no longer a functional Sefer Torah. They are pieces of the Luchot. It is like a Sefer Torah which is missing a column, which is also not viewed as a full Sefer Torah. However, argues the Rav, Amnam, Adayin nishar baluchot chalok Kedushat Haguf. The Luchot retained the sanctity of their material object. They retained the Kedushat Haguf. The Lagabe Kedushat Haguf, Kaimalan Kedushat Haguf lo pakabichti. Because when it comes to the holiness afforded to the physical material object, that is never removed. And now he compares this to the Talmid Chacham who forgets his Torah. And he says the same thing is true for a Talmid Chacham. And this, I think, is a really powerful idea. Chala chalok kedushat haguf. A Talmid Chacham's body has kedusha, has sanctity. Mishum delimud haTorah mikadeshet et guf ha'adam halomed Torah. Learning Torah, what we're all doing on this Sunday morning, sanctifies the body of the person engaged in Torah learning. Ulefi zeh, based on this, nira levarer et hagmar didan d'chayvim lekaved talmid chacham shachach et talmudo. This explains why we have to afford honor to a talmid chacham, even if they don't know Torah anymore. Because even though they might not have the knowledge of Torah, they still have the kedushat haguf. So what the Rav just did is he basically compares the Luchot to the Talmid Chacham, and he says in both there is the Kedushat Haguf, there is the holiness of the physical object, and there's the Kedushat Sefer Torah. There's a holiness because it's a Sefer Torah, or there's the holiness of kind of the knowledge. And he says, just like in the broken Luchot, while they may have lost their sanctity as a as a Sefer Torah, but they preserve their Kedushat Haguf, the same is true for a Talmid Chacham. Even though a Talmid Chacham might not know Torah anymore when they age or due to other circumstances out of their control, we still have to honor him because learning Torah itself affords a sanctity that can never be removed. And he says, okay, so then he goes on and he says something a little bit scary that I think maybe for tshuva purposes is a little bit frightening. And he says, but what if you forget you're learning machmat pshia because you're being negligent or willfully kind of pushing it out of your mind, right? In the Talmud, it specifically was addressing a case of someone who forgets things because of onus, because of things that were outside of their control. But what if you forget something willfully? And he says, in that case, maybe that person does lose their right to kavod. And that's like a little bit of a scary thing, right? It almost sounds like, well, if you sin, then you're no longer eligible for this kedusha, for this preservation of holiness that lasts even when we're not in the state that we once were in. But I think he rescues us at the end because he quotes from the Shulchan Aruch in the context of tefillah, where there's a rule that says if you miss a tefillah because of onus, because of circumstances outside of your control, you can make it up in the next slot. So if I miss mincha because I couldn't daven mincha because something that I totally had no control and couldn't plan over happens, I can daven mariv twice. And so in that context, the poskim try to define what counts as onus, what reaches that threshold of it was outside of your control. And the conclusion there is a little bit of a lower bar than I think some of us might have expected. And one of the examples that they give is you were busy with work and you couldn't afford a loss. It also gives the example of being drunk. And what I think this enables us to do, if we accept these definitions, is it allows us to say if we are in a place in our life where we are maybe not as full of Torah as we once were, or we've maybe lost some abilities that we used to have, as long as that wasn't like actively us trying to step away from Torah or us actively trying to forget those things that we find meaningful, we still retain that kedusha. And so if things get busy and we're not, this, I remember this being a big thing when I was in seminary, right? You leave seminary and you're not going to be learning anymore. You're going to be out of the Beit Midrash, and instead of doing morning seder and night seder, you're maybe going to learn for half an hour a day. Maybe what this is allowing us to say is that doesn't mean you've lost it all, right? You can still maintain kedusha, obviously, if you're not willfully neglecting that part of your life. But I think it gives almost this opportunity to maintain that kedusha, just like we do for a Talmid Chacham who maybe has forgotten what he's taught, and just like we do with a broken Luchot, even though we can't view them as a Sefer Torah anymore. So that's the second source that links from the broken Luchot to the Talmid Chacham, and that I think we can draw from for ourselves in understanding what happens when we're not in a place where we maybe once were or wish that we could be.
Does the Rav address the opinion in the Yerushalmi that you quoted?
I think so. I read the whole piece a few weeks ago, and I don't remember. Yeah, so I can't say for sure. I do think he brings it up though, but it's a good question. I would have to take a look again. Okay, I want to look at one more source. This was a very exciting source for me. It was one that I wasn't really familiar with. It's from one of the novels of Rav Chaim Sabato, Eretz Me'aretz Tzmach. And so Rav Sabato was born in Egypt to a Syrian family, made Aliyah, I think, in the 50s, and then was one of the founders of Yeshiva Ma'ale Adumim with Rav Rabinovich. But in addition to being a tremendous Talmid Chacham, he actually wrote a few novels. And this fictional book is based largely on his experiences and his family experiences. It's specifically linked to the experience of I'll say non-Ashkenazi Olim to Eretz Yisrael and the Ma'abara experience, the experience of being in those camps where a lot of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews were living. And it's a beautiful book. I put the link there. You can find even this whole chapter online. And I read part of it almost like modern Midrash, because the piece that I'm going to bring now is actually from a part of the story where his grandfather is giving a eulogy for a Hasidic Rebbe that died. And the Hasidic Rebbe did not have any of his Hasidim, and he sort of died alone. And this Syrian rabbi was being called to give the hesped, and it's a very touching scene. And so this is part of that eulogy. So again, this is fictional, but I think we can read it almost like Midrash. So in part of this eulogy, the fictional grandfather, based on his real grandfather, I think, says as follows. Im kain echem zichronam livracha luchot v'shivrei luchot munachim ba'aron v'halosha shvarim elu maskeret avon hem lanu. So we ask the following question: why on earth do the rabbis tell us that the broken luchot were preserved in the aron if these broken pieces are a reminder of sin? I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea that we don't like to do things that remind God of our sin, right? A famous, I think, common custom is not to wear gold on Yom Kippur because it reminds us of Chet HaEgel. So if we don't want to remind God of our sins, why would we keep these literal pieces of the literal broken Luchot that Moshe smashed because of the greatest sin the Jewish people had done at that time? So he says as follows: Darshu Rabotenu, our rabbis taught, when the Jewish people left Egypt, they were on the 49th level of impurity. And every day they went up one step on the process of purity until they reached the 49th level of Tahara, of purity, and that's when they got the Torah from Har Sinai. That's what a lot of people view as the significance of Sfirat HaOmer. There's 49 days from Pesach to Shavuot, and it's the 49 steps to go from the Tuma to the Tahara. So Aliyah Zu, this ascent from impurity to purity, chutz miderech hateva haita, that was not a natural phenomenon. How could it be possible for someone to go from the 49th level of impurity to the 49th level of purity in 49 days? There's no way. And he says as follows: V'kivan she'aliyah zu shelo b'derech hateva haita, since this was not natural, naflu mimena, they were not able to sustain it. Shema shezacha lo adam b'lo amal b'torach eino mitkayem beyado, something that you get but that isn't achieved through your work, you won't be able to sustain and you won't be able to keep. Therefore, the Jewish people failed, and they had to do another tikkun for 40 days to kind of elevate themselves. And he says that is the hint of the Luchot. The first Luchot were broken when Bnei Israel fell down from that level. And that's why he explains the second Luchot Moshe had to make himself. Only things that you work on yourself are things that are able to last. So then the question is, why keep the first ones? If the first ones can't last because they were from some miraculous growth that was unsustainable, that was from a moment of inspiration, but can't actually carry us through, why do we want to keep them? And so what he does in the next paragraph is he compares it to the Midrash, that a fetus in its mother's womb knows all of Torah, and that as soon as they come out, the malach hits it and they forget it. And he says the idea of that is so that anytime you learn in the rest of your life, you're just reminding yourself of things that you forgot. And he says, again, what's the point of that? And so the grandfather giving the eulogy for the Admor in Rav Sabato's book says is as follows, and we'll read the last paragraph together. God desires what is good for the Jewish people. And brought them to this highest level of the 49th level of purity, even though he knew that it was unsustainable and they would fall from it. They will from then on desire to reach that level again. It is not new for them anymore. They are familiar with that level, and so now they can strive to reach that again. Lefichach tzivta Torah, luchot v'shivrei luchot munachim ba'aron. That's why we need both sets of tablets in the aron. Because he says the broken luchot aren't reminding us of the sin. The broken luchot are reminding us of that tremendously high level that we had reached. And even though that was not a sustainable level because we hadn't done the work that was necessary, we can know the heights that we can reach, and we can try to strive for that. And that's what he says. And he finally concludes with what the Talmud learns from that you need to respect the Zakein who forgot what he learned, because both Luchot were in the Aron, which is especially poignant at this scene in the book where this Hasidic Rebbe is dying or has died without any of his Talmidim and with no one to teach his Torah to. And so I think what this piece from Rav Sabato does is first, it gives a motivator for doing tshuva. And it says, we come from a good place. We've reached high levels. You might not be there right now. You might have done something wrong. You might not be able to sustain something that you were once able to sustain. But the fact that you know that you were once there should encourage you to try to be there again. It also tells us, I think, something that's really important for tshuva, which is artificial growth and moments of inspiration aren't really sustainable. And I often think at this time of the year of what the line that I heard in the name of Rabbi Liebtag, that it's much more important what you do between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah than what you do between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is to say, it takes work and it takes effort, but we can do it. And finally, what I think this message tells us, and what this will close, is that literally the word tshuva means to return, to come back. And I think that is symbolically represented really beautiful in this idea of having the luchot and the broken luchot, where we're trying to go back to what was once there. And even if we've fallen, we're going back to a familiar place. And so to wrap up, what we did is we saw that the luchot are directly related to Yom Kippur, because that's the day that we got this luchot. We saw that the idea of the broken luchot being preserved, and specifically the majority opinion that they were preserved in the Aron, is a source for the idea that we respect people, even if they don't know the Torah they once knew or don't have the abilities that they once did, which is again a reminder of our mortality and our fragility, which serves as an impetus for tshuva. And then we saw the idea in the Rav and Rav Sabato that I think can also serve as encouragement during this time period of tshuva. May we all be able to live up to those high demands. I'm wishing everyone a Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice.
Yesh kayach.
Even if I wasn't biased, I would say that very, very nice.